The state of disaster over the electricity crisis announced by President Cyril Ramaphosa during the State of the Nation address yesterday is now in full swing. Let's speak to Martin van Staden, Deputy Head of Policy Research at Solidarity Research Institute. They threatened legal action if the President indeed instituted the state of disaster. Thank you very much for your time, Martin, this afternoon. Perhaps let's start with Solidarity's understanding of the state of disaster and trying to go through some of your concerns.
I must start, thank you very much, by saying that I am with the Institute of Race Relations and not with Solidarity. However, I can speak to the fact that litigation is certainly necessary against the state of disaster. The COVID-19 pandemic and the government's handling of it is very fresh in our minds, and the fact that various civil society organizations at this stage, including several political parties and the Organization for Undoing Tax Abuse, OUTA, has also announced considering litigation against the state of disaster, because we know what the government tends to do with this power. And in this case, South Africa's electricity crisis is the result of bad policy, not the result of a virus that we did not see coming. So the invoking a Disaster Management Act is really, we would say, ultra vires, certainly outside of the scope of what that act was intended to do, and that is to be a stopgap. If there isn't other legislation or regulations available to government to deal with a given problem, then you declare a state of disaster and you use the stopgap powers that the DMA gives government. But in this case, we have the Electricity Regulation Act, which gives the Minister of Energy and NERSA wide powers to eliminate red tape, to procure new capacity on an emergency basis. The Minister of Finance is giving his budget speech in a few days, so the statement that this will allow emergency budget shifts is simply not true. It is entirely within government's current power, without the extraordinary authority given to it under a state of disaster, to deal with its own crisis that it has created for us, and that for that reason, urgent litigation, to stop this very serious threat to our constitutional institutions and to our civil liberties and economic freedoms is a very important step by Solidarity, OUTA, the DA, etc.
I do beg your pardon. So what, that process, you've already approached the courts, in case I missed that, or you are yet to approach the courts and join those organizations as well?
So like I said, I'm of the Institute of Race Relations. We are not approaching the courts. Solidarity is certainly approaching the courts. OUTA has announced it is in the process of considering its options, and I believe the Democratic Alliance, the DA, has also already approached the court. So those three organizations, at the very least, are in the process of going to court, and I would imagine it would be on an urgent basis, given that the disaster was just declared last night, and we know, we've seen, the President himself alluded to the fact that during the COVID-19 lockdowns, 2 million additional South Africans joined the ranks of the unemployed. So we can see just how a state of disaster can be abused and what would happen if it is not challenged. During COVID, we didn't really know. It was new territory for us. So litigation came months after the state of disaster was declared. But that is different now. We know we've burned our hands at the stove of states of disaster, and it's very heartening that civil society is taking up its constitutional role of keeping government power in check.
Let's take it a step further, and thank you for the clarity, Martin, and take a look at the announcement of a Minister of Electricity that will be based at the presidency. Your position on that?
Well, that's certainly not necessary. We already have a Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources, and the President is entirely within his lawful powers to put a different person in that ministry. So creating another government position, which will require its own salary, perks, protection, office staff, that is simply another burden that the South African taxpayer cannot afford. Rather, the president should have appointed a new Minister of Electricity in the position of the Minister of Energy, if that is what he truly wanted. The new Minister of Electricity in the presidency will not have any new powers. There is no legislation that recognizes such a portfolio. So just like other entities within the presidency, this, I imagine, would be largely a consulting and advisory position, a kind of institution that gives direction to the Minister of Energy and to NERSA and gives advice. So in that respect, it's effectively just another government committee that we have many of, a task team to kind of deal with load shedding without the government in fact doing what is necessary. And I mean, it's been clear for a long time what's necessary to solve the electricity crisis, and that is that Eskom, it's about time for Eskom to receive a free hand to deal with its own human resources affairs. It needs to be able to fire non-performing employees. It needs to be able to hire based on merit exclusively, to get experts in from abroad, if necessary, to come and help solve the problem. It needs to be liberated in procurement from local content requirements, from taking extraneous considerations into account when it gets new capacity. So it needs to care only about generating power, maybe a bit less about environmental considerations. And then ultimately, the problem we've had in South Africa is that we've had too much centralization. Eskom has a monopoly, and especially a monopoly on coal and nuclear power generation, and the private sector is contributing very, very little when it comes to those baseload, reliable sources of electricity. So that monopoly needs to be ended. And the president's statement last night that, in fact, what we need is more central direction in terms of this state of disaster, and everyone needs to take their marching orders from the central government, in fact, is going to contribute to the problem. It's precisely because we didn't have enough decentralization of risk in electricity up to now that we are stuck with this single public utility behemoth that is dragging us down. So we need more decentralization. And the solutions are very well known, I would say, to truly solving the electricity crisis without suspending civil liberties, economic freedoms, and all the other things that we experienced during the COVID-19 lockdown that a state of disaster allows government to do.
Well, Martin, the president believes he's doing something, right? Because today in the morning during the Gulf session post-SONA, he says that the criticism towards this move of having a state of disaster on Eskom is misguided. People wanted him to do something, and now he's doing something. It would seem that this does still not satisfy. Your response to the president saying that the criticism is misguided?
Yeah, the criticism is certainly not misguided. The president certainly has to do something, and he did give that speech in July of last year, announcing widespread reforms. And one of those, for instance, was the feed-in scheme, which would have allowed households and businesses to contribute excess solar power that they are generating for themselves back into the grid. The president announced that would happen because in Vietnam, for instance, that really helped end Vietnam's load shedding crisis. So that generated quite a bit of excitement, but it never happened. It's now almost 6 months later after the president announced those reforms, and Eskom simply did not do what it was instructed to do by the president. And the state of disaster certainly does not change that. A state of disaster is operationalized through regulations by ministers. So to the extent that regulations and red tape are already the problem that stand in the way of Eskom and NERSA and so forth doing what needs to be done, it's simply a matter of getting the minister who is responsible for the regulation to withdraw it. The state of disaster is simply going to be additional regulations, and is certainly not the part of the solution. So the president is quite incorrect by saying that he just needed to do something random. There are particular things that he needs to do. And the state of disaster, which gives the guilty party, government, the institution that landed us in this mess in the first place, widespread additional powers. That is certainly not what I think civil society has been asking the president and government to do over the last few years. What civil society has been asking the government to do is to allow ESCOM to make merit-based appointments, to procure based on quality and affordability, and to allow the private sector to get involved in electricity generation and distribution. These are things that are currently within government's power, and it does not need a state of disaster to do that. The state of disaster is a window dressing exercise at best, and at worst, it is going to, again, like lockdown, involve gaps in accountability for procurement. It's going to involve a central command council for electricity, which is going to perhaps dictate to municipalities, which are already taking steps like Cape Town to procure their own electricity. That council might overrule the municipalities. So I am not very optimistic that the powers that a government will get in terms of a state of disaster are going to be wielded in a responsible fashion. Rather, government needs to use the powers it has already been granted by law many years ago.
Yeah, but wait, there's more, because the Auditor General, who has enough on her plate, is already tasked with overseeing the spending here and making sure, or at least have an oversight role. Thank you very much to Martin van Staden. He's with the Institute for Race Relations.